Hello and welcome to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. This is episode 36 of the weekly Story Savvy series, where we tackle the 52 biggest self editing topics and tips to help you make your good story great. As an aspiring author asks me, a developmental editor, all of the questions that you have wanted to. We have covered so much in this series so far, including the last 2 weeks' episodes on discussing sensory immersion, so sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Today, we are going to revisit story pacing, this time looking at some new aspects of it. By the end of this episode, you will hopefully feel confident gauging whether or not your big moments are paying off and satisfying, and if your small moments are perhaps misleading and in need of tweaking. Joining me today to ask all of the questions is my good friend and co host, Agnes Wolfe. Welcome.
Hi, I'm an aspiring fantasy author who hopes to release her first middle grade fantasy later next year. And also, I am the host and founder of Authors Alcove. So, today I'm here to tackle this topic more at the scene level, or rather, page level, rather than the full global level. So, first off, I'm kind of excited about this one because this is actually what I've been working on specifically through my series, and I've gotten quite a significantly through that, and, so this is really exciting. Anyway, um, I often like to make sure before we even start that we know exactly the definitions and all of that, and we don't necessarily need definitions, but can we just talk specifically about what we are really talking about today?
Yeah, we are talking about making sure that the moments that are actually important to your plot, characters, or world come across that way to the reader and vice versa.
So, what are we defining as big moments or small moments here? I know we touched on this in previous episodes, but clearly it's always helpful to start out with.
Absolutely. Big moments have high stakes, high emotions, big reveals, point of no return choices or actions, or are a vital, precise setup for something that is going to come later with a nice payoff. Or they can be the wrap up and payoff of an existing plot thread that was set up earlier. On the other side, small moments are everything else. Or if you want to get narrower in that definition, they are the moments that are needed to transition from one thing to another, are needed to account for realistic time passage within a conversation or a scene, or moments that only exist to set up something in more of a general background way, but that, yeah, be that characterization or world building or tone, something like that.
So, how is this topic different than episode 13, and how are they also related?
Here we are looking at the aspects you can tackle by just reading the one page with the moment on it. In episode 13, we were talking about tackling the pacing of the whole book, or acts and sequences of scenes, and how each chapter scores with an eye towards adding, deleting, rewriting, rearranging scenes to maximize your story pacing at the global and holistic level and in those senses. What we are talking about here is more how you are delivering those small moments within a scene or a chapter to fine tune that pacing and making sure that it will be perceived by the reader how you intended it to be.
So, let's first tackle big moments. How can we make our big moments feel like big moments?
Doing so is all about narrowing focus, forcing the protagonist to deeply and irreversibly interact with that moment, making sure that noticeable stakes and a needed choice are inherent in that moment. And to some extent, about adding extra movement to big action moments and extra description or big revelations or seed planting moments to those kind of big moments to make sure that they're all landing right. A couple other aspects to keep an eye on around helping these big moments land include, first of all, you can try naming some small aspect of that bigness or a larger part of that bigness within the narration, dialogue, or internal processing to help it feel like a big moment. You can also make sure that you are showing that the immediate consequences and resolution of that moment are deeply felt and impactful to how things move forward to really hammer home how big the event itself was. It's all about reader experience, really. If a big moment doesn't feel big when it's happening, it's really going to confuse or disappoint your reader.
So when I think of big, I also think of like visually big. But I do want to ask you, are there certain things we should consider around word, like such as word count or descriptions or other areas that have more to do with the actual structure of a big moment rather than the actual like sharing emotional experience of it? Are those related at all?
Sort of. I don't have a super clear answer that I can offer here. Sometimes shorter or less described moments can feel smaller, particularly in slower paced scenes. However, shortening narrative and reducing description can also help make a big moment feel bigger in a fast paced scene. I think that in general, the actual structure of a big moment versus a small one is how much emphasis and attention you put on the moment. So, in some spots, longer passages can really hold focus, force deep exploration of the moment, and really push a ton of meaning and interest into it. In other spots, padding things out with more description that are more background or tertiary to the moment at hand can help it make it feel smaller by mixing the moment in with a lot of other smallness. You really have to make that call for yourself in each moment, bearing the other considerations that we're going to go over in this episode in mind. I will say the closest thing I will do to a blanket statement here is overwriting small moments and underwriting big moments is the most common issue that I see by a mile. But those are both very squishy terms, overwriting and underwriting, with a wide range of specific definitions, meanings, or applications depending on the moment that's being looked at.
Speaking of that overwriting and underwriting, how can we tell if we have written an accidental big moment?
Tricky question. First, I want to say that if I'm understanding this question correctly, I might rephrase it as what happens when you write a small moment that feels way bigger than it should. Because at the end of the day, that's what an accidental big moment is, phrased in a way that correctly identifies it as a small moment, which then allows you to more easily reach for a solution. How you can spot this can be very, very tricky. Getting feedback on that from an outside reader is how I can say confidently that I have found and fixed issues like that in my own work. It might also help to go back to that concept of ranking things, aspects, moments by impact and intensity, which I'm pretty sure I went over in episode 18 on intensity. So, if you have a handful of moments which you suspect might be coming across as bigger than they should, try assigning them an honest number for how intense or big the stakes, emotions, or impact on how the plot moves forward are. Where does that fall against the same sort of score for a big moment that you are sure is actually a genuine big moment? Then rank how big you think those two moments are coming across, being portrayed to the reader in your language and descriptions and balances and everything else. Look for disparity between those two sets of scores. If your authentic big moment is, let's say, an intensity score of 8 out of 10, but then the less big moment you are questioning only scores 4 out of 10, but they are both being presented to the reader like 8 out of 10, then you very much need to go in and lower the presented bigness of the lower intensity ones so that they are more proportional to each other. I hope that makes sense.
It really does.
Okay,
So
good.
I feel like this question is kind of an offshoot of that question, but this time specifically talking about small moments. When do we know if it really is supposed to be a small moment or maybe it should be a deleted scene?
Ooh, yeah, this one hits me in the author. So it's relevant to talk about this because you don't want to overburden your reader with things they feel like they need to remember or emotionally invest in when that isn't the case. If you treat too many things or everything like it's a big deal, then the reader will quickly burn out on that and nothing will continue to feel big by comparison. Sometimes this can be used intentional as red herrings, like in a mystery novel, but I recommend against doing so often. Only do this sparingly and try to only do it in appropriate genres that expect red herrings. Outside of that, I encourage folks to read up on Chekhov's gun. I assume that most readers have at least heard of this. Go read an article on it. Essentially, if you put any kind of emphasis on introducing a gun or metaphor for it early on in the story, that gun had better go off later in the story. Otherwise, you are presenting a small moment of introducing a gun as bigger than it should have been. If that gun doesn't go off later in the story, readers will feel like the book is poorly designed, poorly conceived, poorly executed, or poorly edited. So if you want to introduce something for the sake of it, as flavoring or immersion or for a similar reason, then make sure that it feels as equally small as intended, and that will spare your reader this feeling or conclusion about the poor quality of the story. So, how you make a small moment feel small is keep the protagonist more interested in something else, pushing the thing more to the background or more to the side of the focus. You can just describe it less. That's probably the most common issue and solution that I see. You can make the protagonist's reaction to that moment flatter, so removing or dimming that emotional reaction to the moment. You can reduce the stakes and you can shorten how long the thing or the moment is discussed. Uh, yeah, there's a handful of other tools you can try. It really, really depends on the specifics of the exact moment and what considerations are currently making it feel too big, which need to which needs to be dialed down. So, speaking directly to your question of how do you know if it's just a small moment that needs to get dialed down or scrapped entirely, just go back to that purpose. Is it serving a purpose? If you took it out, would it create a plot glitch somewhere else? Would it make a conversation that you are saying took 30 minutes feel like it only took 10? There's something in there to assess, and at the end of the day, you need to make that call.
So I have a question specifically. It's actually about my book. I had a Chekhov's gun situation that did not have the trigger pulled at the end. So you pointed that out, and I realized it's because I'm actually needed it to happen so that way something happens in another book. But I forgot
Mhm.
to reintroduce it later on so that you, as a reader, did not real. You're like, okay, this was a pointless situation. You should take that out. And I was like, oh, so how would you suggest like letting people know, okay, may not be as small as it seems when it might not pertain immediately.
I feel like I've talked about this from a different angle in an earlier episode in this series. If you want to do a moment like that, that is setting up a Chekhov's gun that isn't intended to go off until book four or whatever, touch on it again at the end. If within the narration or your characters specifically inside themselves or to another character acknowledge, hey, wasn't that a thing? And name that it is left unanswered, that allows the reader to go, I see the author's remembering it, we'll get to that. That's all that really matters. You just need to acknowledge, hey, I did ask you to invest in this, and I did ask you to remember this, and I did put emphasis on this. In this last chapter, or second or third to last chapter of this book, I'm just going to take a sentence here and reassure you that was intentional. We will get to that. Bear with me.
I love that. So what is, I feel like I ask this every episode, but what is one of the biggest mistakes you've seen writers make around not treating the big moments like they are that, or particularly in a way that really hurt their pacing?
First of all, I think it's great that you ask this question in every episode. One of my favorite sayings, literally as long as I can remember, has been the only thing better than learning from your mistakes is learning from the mistakes of others. That is what a lot of this series is about, so continue asking this question. To answer that, the first thing that comes to mind is there was a book I edited, I think it was late last year, where the climax took less than one full page. It had great buildup in the story up to that point, great escalating tensions leading up through that third quadrant, and then wham bam, thank you, ma'am, it was over. So, this is kind of an extreme example as the climax is and or should be the biggest big moment of an entire book, but it's a very clear one. So in that case, the issues around this big moment not delivering like a big moment were layered. First of all, the author didn't make the big moment hard enough to reach the far side of. So when you look at a big moment, you've got some build up to it, and then let's say this is the big moment. There's space there, and making it more difficult to get to the other side can very much increase the bigness of that moment. If that author had added a few hurdles, setbacks, twists, barriers, and or difficult choices for the protagonist to make, that would have helped a lot. Second layer on that, they didn't narrow their focus as the narrative, as the protagonist, or for the reader. The protagonist was still thinking about the subplots pretty heavily while they were in that pivotal climax of the primary plot, which kept it from feeling emotionally big. In real life, when something really matters, we give it our full and undivided attention. Writing big moments in fiction should absolutely reverse engineer that to give that same sense to the protagonist and the reader. And then the last layer on this that I feel is worth mentioning here is that the author described some vital details during the climax needed to understand what was happening. Yes, I will acknowledge this could be taken as hypocritical. I constantly recommend explaining things just in time for it to be very, very relevant versus just in case. But the climax is an exception. The reader has to know everything they need to in order to understand the climax before they get there. At the latest, all of the technical know-how, the world building, the power establishment, whatever, those pieces need to be in place and understood by the end of the chapter before the climax chapter. If that means that a certain aspect that is going to get used in the climax needs to be forced to become relevant earlier in the story so that you can do that just in time explanations before the climax, then so be it. That is the right choice, rather than waiting until the climax to go, oh, by the way, dragons are a thing, or whatever the piece is that you would need to explain in the climax. Find a way to bring it up tangibly before then and do the explanations there. The big moment, failing to feel like or failing to be presented as such, results in all momentum of the story being snuffed out in a beat. All of the momentum the author had done a really, really good job of building up in this story I'm thinking of. So, over probably 70,000 words, maybe 80,000 words, just winked out when that climax failed to pay off with the catharsis promised. Without high stakes, high emotions, large victories, be that internal or external, a sense of sacrifice or loss, or whatever other values you want to equate to big in your specific genre and story, the moment will not pay off. And that is second only, really, to expositional stagnation for stopping momentum dead in its tracks.
So I just want to wrap up real quick. I do have one last question. Um, what about, it's kind of the same question. What about not making small moments feel small enough?
Yeah.
And how does that affect the pacing?
When your small moments don't feel small enough, you run the risk of your pacing constantly pushing too hard, which can burn out your readers. And I've touched on this a little bit before here. The most common issue that I see on this topic is authors describing everything like it matters a lot. That just isn't feasible in fiction. I am sure that some real living people feel like every tiny thing in their, real lived life, every minute of it is a very big deal. But most people don't, and would probably agree that that sounds exhausting and probably insanity inducing. So, remembering that having some small moments in and around the big ones is a much better mindset and approach for fiction. Yes, I suggest emphatically and often that you not bore your reader, but sometimes you do have to mention a meal being eaten, or a car being driven, or a piece of clothing being assessed for value or status, something like that. And doing so in a way that supports the big moment that I suggest all scenes be built around, that scene core event. Go back to episode 30, I think it was. Keeping that balance so that it is supporting the big moment, but doesn't steal focus away from that big moment is the goal. I have edited a number of books where I ended up mentally exhausted trying to keep track of everything in order to provide good feedback on what I thought was a cram-packed, super complicated plots with tons of foreshadowing, only to reach the end and realize in retrospect that less than a quarter of those, hey, look at me, remember this detail moments actually were that. I ended up needlessly mentally exhausted by all of those small moments coming across like I really needed to notice and remember them. And readers are going to, again, find that either disappointing or frustrating when they reach the end and go, are you kidding me? I didn't have to remember all of those details? Why did you do this to me?
Thank you so much for your insight. I really appreciate all that you share. And I think this episode, particularly because this is what I'm focused on, is very important. And I might have to like review some of the things that you said, because
Nice.
this is what my round of edits right now have been, is looking at the scene level, making sure that the pacing is right, making sure that the scene is important. Although I am touching back on the beginning too a little bit at the moment, but again, it's because I'm looking at the overall pacing of scenes and importance of stuff. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And yeah, it's delightful when one of these topics is very much where you are at. That feels good. All right. So, thank you to everyone who has followed along with this series. We would very much appreciate if you could like and subscribe to the Heartbound Editing podcast and the Authors Alcove podcast, where you can find lots more content for fantasy readers and authors beyond this joint series. Next week, we are going to go over how to best handle and present to your reader jumps in time, location, and POV in narrative fiction, and how to check and polish those spots in your own manuscript. Looking forward to it.
Can't wait to chat with you again. See you then.
Thank you so much for listening to the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I look forward to bringing you more content to help you make your good story great so it can change lives and change your world. Follow along to hear more, or visit my website linked in the description to learn how I can help you and your story to flourish. See you next time.